The golden hues of the Sacramento sunset painted long shadows on the pavement as Eric Porter drove home after a demanding day at the office. His sedan moved smoothly along the bustling streets, the soft hum of the radio filling the space with a calming melody. The air conditioning whirred gently, a welcome relief from the warm California air. Eric exhaled, eager to put the day behind him and enjoy a quiet evening. But just as he slowed for a yellow light turning red, the sharp blare of a police siren cut through the peaceful moment. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed what he already knew. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the fading daylight. Eric furrowed his brows but remained composed, signaling as he pulled over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window, resting his hands on the steering wheel, a precaution he had learned from past experiences. The sound of a car door opening followed, and in his peripheral vision, Eric saw a tall figure approaching. Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a hardened expression, walked toward Eric's car with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the dimming sky. Adjusting his belt, he came to a stop at the driver's side window, casting a scrutinizing gaze over Eric. "License and registration?" Larson commanded, his tone flat yet firm, carrying an air of automatic suspicion. Eric, ever the professional, complied without hesitation. He reached into his glove compartment, retrieving the requested documents with measured movements. As he handed them over, he could feel Larson's eyes studying him. Not just his identification, but something deeper, something unspoken. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light," Larson stated, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned slightly but nodded. "I see. I thought I had slowed in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond right away. Instead he lingered, his grip tightening around the documents, as his eyes flicked from the license to Eric's face. His posture shifted subtly but noticeably. It was no longer a routine stop. Something about Eric had caught his attention, something that made him pause, evaluate, and, in an instant, form an assumption. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked abruptly. Eric hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But it was clear that Larson wasn't truly interested in the answer. His questions took on a sharper edge, his tone tinged with something beyond simple law enforcement. His gaze held a quiet challenge, one that Eric recognized all too well. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson pressed. Eric met his eyes without flinching. "Just going home," he said, his voice unwavering. But something about his composure seemed to unnerve Larson. The officer straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, as if searching for a reason to escalate the situation. The air between them grew heavier, an unspoken tension thickening the space. Eric could see it in Larson's stance. The officer didn't just see him as another driver. He saw something more, something that warranted suspicion. The stop was no longer about a minor traffic infraction, and that realization meant this was only the beginning. The atmosphere inside Eric Porter's car was calm, but outside the tension was mounting. Officer Bradley Larson's stance shifted slightly, his posture tightening as he scanned Eric's face. The moment had passed where this could have remained a routine traffic stop. Now, suspicion hung thick in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. "You seem awfully composed," Larson muttered, tapping his fingers lightly on the pocket where he had tucked Eric's documents. "Most people get a little nervous when they're pulled over." Eric met his gaze evenly. "I believe in staying calm, officer. It's usually the best approach in these situations." Larson scoffed, his lips twitching with something that wasn't quite amusement. "Yeah? You sound like you've had plenty of experience with situations like this." Eric tilted his head slightly, reading between the lines. There it was. The assumption, the expectation that he should be flustered, uncertain, or defensive, that his composed demeanor was somehow an indication of guilt. "I've been pulled over before," Eric admitted, his voice measured. "I know the importance of clarity in these interactions." Larson studied him, the muscles in his jaw flexing. He stepped back half a step, folding his arms. "Step out of the vehicle for me." Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his expression remained unchanged. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Larsson's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." A slow breath left Eric's nose. The words weren't a direct threat, but the meaning was clear. Either he complied, or this situation would escalate. Without another word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping onto the pavement. Larsson's eyes flicked over him as he stood up. Eric was slightly taller, his shoulders squared, his suit crisp, despite the long day. He was the picture of professionalism. Someone who looked like he belonged in an office, not on the side of the road being questioned. And yet, Larsson still wasn't convinced. "Hands where I can see them," Larsson ordered. Eric complied, keeping his hands relaxed and visible. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Larsson smirked faintly. "Just routine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" he asked smoothly. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch, and for a moment, Larsson's composure faltered. He straightened, his hand drifting toward his belt, more a reflex than a necessity. "What's your tone?" he said sharply. Eric didn't move. His voice remained even. "I'm simply asking a question, officer. Transparency is important, wouldn't you agree?" The tension stretched thick between them. Larsson's fingers twitched, his frustration barely masked. He had expected compliance, maybe a little fear. Instead, Eric remained unshaken. Larsson took another step forward, invading Eric's space. "You seem pretty confident," he muttered. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next." Eric tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For half a second, Larsson froze. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing in a mixture of confusion and irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice clipped. "Place your hands on the hood. I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, incredulous but still composed. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Larsson's jaw flexed, but his patience had worn thin. "I'm not going to ask you again." Eric hesitated for a flicker of a second, then turned and placed his palms flat on the hood of his car. The cool metal met his skin, but he felt something else. A shift in power. This wasn't just a search, it was a test, and Eric knew exactly how to pass it. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unyielding. Officer Bradley Larsson patted Eric Porter down with swift, firm movements, his hands lingering just a second too long, as if trying to provoke a reaction. But Eric remained still, his hands pressed flat against the cool hood of his sedan, his breath steady. Years of experience had taught him that control wasn't about force. It was about composure. Larsson took a step back, frustrated. "You're clean," he muttered. Eric straightened, smoothing his suit jacket with deliberate calm. "Of course I am," he said simply. His tone wasn't smug, but the certainty in his voice made Larsson's jaw clench. "I'm not done," Larsson snapped. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to maintain control. He wasn't used to this, an interaction slipping from his grasp. He squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim authority. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric met his gaze, unreadable. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larsson's eyes narrowed. "That's so. You a lawyer or something?" A faint smile ghosted over Eric's lips. "Or something." The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Larsson even more. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space. "Listen," he growled, "you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't flinch. "I don't think anything, officer," he replied, his voice still calm, controlled. "I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it." The words hung between them, a quiet challenge that Larsson wasn't prepared for. His lips parted, his breath quickened, and then, before he could stop himself, he let something slip. "People like you always—" He cut himself off, But the damage was already done. Eric's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture, a quiet understanding of what had just been revealed. "People like me," he repeated, his voice soft but sharp. Larsen stiffened. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "I think I do," Eric said, his tone now carrying a weight that made Larsen shift uncomfortably. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." The realization hung in the air. For the first time, Larsen looked uncertain, as if he'd suddenly realized he was standing on unstable ground. His confidence, his authority, all of it had been built on an assumption that had just crumbled beneath him. Eric let the silence settle before finally speaking. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larsen's brow furrowed. "I don't care who you are," he shot back. But there was a crack in his tone now, a flicker of doubt. Eric reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, watching as Larsen's fingers twitched near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." Larsen's eyes followed his movement as Eric pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open. The gleaming badge inside caught the fading sunlight. Eric Porter, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larsen froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority, and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Larsen murmured, his throat tightening. "Yes," Eric said, his voice unwavering. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity it represents." Larsen took a step back, as if the badge itself carried weight. The power dynamic had shifted, and he felt it in his bones. Eric took a step forward, closing the distance Larsen had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larsen?" he asked. Larsen didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into quicksand, and there was no way out. Eric's gaze bore into him. "It's not just the profiling. It's not just the baseless escalation. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to." He let the words settle. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold and why." Larsen swallowed, but no words came. Eric's voice was even, but the indictment was clear. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect." Larsen's shoulders sagged slightly. The weight of his own misjudgment crushed him. He wasn't in control anymore, and for the first time, he knew it. The weight of the moment settled heavily between them. Officer Bradley Larsen stood stiffly, his face pale, his confidence unraveling in real time. The badge in Eric Porter's hand gleamed under the fading sunlight, a symbol of authority Larsen had never expected to be turned against him. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Eric continued, his voice unwavering. "That I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold, and why." He let the question hang in the air, giving Larsen a moment to absorb the full gravity of what had just happened. Larsen swallowed hard, but no words came. Eric let out a slow breath, his patience measured but firm. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." For the first time that evening, Larsen hesitated. His bravado had drained away, replaced by something closer to unease. He reached into his chest pocket, pulling out Eric's license and registration with slightly trembling fingers before handing them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them neatly into his wallet. He didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them spoke louder than any reprimand could. Larsen had been so sure of his authority, so certain of his ability to control the situation, that he never considered the possibility that the man he was targeting could be the one holding him accountable. But Eric wasn't finished. "You're going to hear from me again," he continued, his voice steady yet carrying an unmistakable edge. Not as a driver stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge. Larsen's lips parted as if to argue, but he stopped himself. The usual arrogance in his posture was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettled discomfort. His badge, the very thing he had used to impose authority, suddenly felt heavier on his chest. Eric turned toward his car, placing his hand on the door handle. Then, as if remembering something, he looked over his shoulder one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Larson had no response. He simply stood there, frozen in place, watching as Eric slid back into his car and started the engine. As Eric pulled away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Larson was still standing in the same spot, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. The officer had entered this encounter believing he was in control, but now he was left with a sinking realization. This was no ordinary stop. This was a career-defining moment, one that would follow him long after the night ended. For Eric, however, this was far from over. The drive home was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He replayed the events in his head not because they were unique, but because they weren't. How many other officers had acted just like Larson? How many people had been mistreated, intimidated, or profiled simply because they didn't fit an officer's idea of who deserved respect? Who could deserve... No, this wasn't the end of a bad traffic stop. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk in the Internal Affairs Division, flipping open a file labeled Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings. Nothing that had ever been taken seriously. Until now. Eric leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered his next move. A knock on his office door made him look up. His assistant, Linda, stepped inside, holding a stack of reports. "Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week," she said. Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "Also, schedule a meeting with Daniels for this afternoon. There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Eric turned back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on one officer. This was bigger than Larson. It was about the entire system that allowed men like him to operate unchecked. He wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. He was ready to fix the problem at its root. The impact of Eric Porter's encounter with Officer Bradley Larson didn't end when he drove away that night. It was only the beginning. The next morning, as he sat in his office at the Internal Affairs Division, Eric knew that what had transpired wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about a culture within law enforcement that had been allowed to fester for too long, one where unchecked authority led to profiling, intimidation, and abuse of power. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the open file on his desk. Officer Bradley Larson. His record was far from clean, but nothing had ever stuck. Minor complaints of excessive stops, vague misconduct reports that were quietly dismissed, and repeated instances of profiling. It was a pattern, one that had gone unchallenged. Until now. A knock on the door broke his focus. Linda, his assistant, stepped in with a folder in hand. "Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the upcoming department review," she said. Eric nodded, taking the folder. "Thanks, Linda. Also, schedule a meeting with the chief for this afternoon. There's something I need to discuss with him." She hesitated, sensing the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said before stepping out. Eric flipped through the pages of Larson's file one more time before closing it. His mind was already made up. This wasn't going to be another internal matter swept under the rug. This was going to be a wake-up call. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a dimly lit conference room. The chief, a grizzled veteran of the force, listened intently as Eric laid out everything that had happened during the traffic stop. He didn't sugarcoat a single detail. "I could have ignored it," Eric admitted. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction. But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this," he muttered. "Good," Eric replied. "It's about time someone did." Daniels looked at him, measuring his words carefully. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation, "not just of individual officers, but of our training, our accountability protocols, and our internal oversight. We need to make it clear. Unchecked bias, intimidation and profiling have no place in this department. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. This isn't going to be easy. Change never is, Eric said firmly, but it's necessary. Within weeks, Eric's push for reform sent shockwaves through the department. Mandatory training sessions were implemented, focusing on bias awareness, proper de-escalation techniques, and accountability. Community outreach programs were expanded, ensuring that civilians had a voice in law enforcement oversight. But the biggest impact came from within. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct began speaking up. More cases like Larson's were uncovered. Officers who had acted with impunity now found themselves facing real consequences. The culture was shifting, slowly but undeniably. As for Larson, his misconduct hearing was swift. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his history of questionable behavior finally caught up with him. He was placed on indefinite suspension pending further investigation. But Eric knew the real victory wasn't just in holding one officer accountable. It was in preventing the next Larson from ever abusing his power in the first place. Months later, Eric stood before a packed room at a community town hall. Officers, city officials, and local residents sat together, listening as he addressed them. "This isn't about blame," Eric said, his voice steady. "This is about responsibility, about ensuring that law enforcement serves and protects every citizen fairly, without prejudice or bias." The audience was silent, absorbing his words. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," he continued. "It's about making sure those who wear the badge do so with integrity, fairness, and accountability. That's the standard we should all demand. That's the badge I believe in." The room erupted in applause, not just from civilians, but from officers who understood the weight of his words. Some looked skeptical, others hopeful, but all were listening. Eric knew change wouldn't come overnight. The system wouldn't fix itself in a matter of months. But the ripple effect had begun, and he was determined to see it through. Because justice wasn't just about one case, it was about setting a new standard. For everyone. Eric Porter had always believed that real change didn't happen overnight. It required persistence, accountability, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. His encounter with Officer Bradley Larson had been more than just a tense traffic stop. It had been a moment of reckoning, a spark that set off a chain reaction within the Sacramento Police Department. Months had passed since that fateful night, and in that time the department had undergone a transformation unlike anything seen before. Thanks to Eric's push, new policies were implemented and oversight was strengthened. Officers were required to undergo rigorous de-escalation training, and internal investigations into previous misconduct cases were reopened. For the first time in years, officers were being held accountable for their actions, not just by their superiors, but by the community they had sworn to protect. But the real impact of Eric's efforts wasn't measured in policy changes alone. It was in the shift in attitude within the department. Officers who had once remained silent when they saw misconduct were now stepping forward. Those who had dismissed concerns about bias and profiling were beginning to acknowledge the problem. Even the community, which had long viewed the police with distrust, was beginning to see signs of progress. One evening, Eric received an unexpected call from Chief Daniels. "Come by my office," the chief said. "There's something I want you to see." When Eric arrived, Daniels handed him a thick folder. Inside were reports, notes, and testimonies from officers who had been influenced by the changes. One in particular stood out. It was from a young patrol officer named Marcus Hall, who had recently intervened in a case where his partner had begun to escalate a routine traffic stop unnecessarily. "Before, I wouldn't have said anything," Officer Hall had written. "I would have let it happen because that's just how things worked. But after everything that's happened, after the conversations we've had, I knew I had to step in. We're supposed to protect people, not intimidate them. And if we can't hold each other accountable, we have no business wearing this badge." Eric exhaled slowly, setting the report down. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was something, a sign that the culture was beginning to shift in the right direction. As he left the chief's office, Eric thought back to his own encounter with Larson. He knew there were still officers like him out there, those who saw their authority as a weapon rather than a responsibility. But he also knew there were officers like Hall, ones who were willing to learn, to change, to do better. Justice wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about fostering integrity. It was about making sure that every officer understood what their badge truly stood for. Eric stepped outside, taking in the cool evening air. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The ripple effect had begun, and he wasn't going to stop until the wave of change reached every corner of the system. Life has a way of revealing true character in unexpected moments. For many, especially those in positions of authority, the temptation to misuse power can be strong. But true leadership isn't about control, it's about responsibility. The story of Eric Porter reminds us that accountability isn't just about catching wrongdoing. It's about setting a standard for integrity and fairness that others will follow. For older generations who have witnessed decades of societal change, this lesson is especially meaningful. Many have lived through times when authority often went unquestioned, when systems operated without transparency, and when individuals felt powerless against injustice. But stories like Eric's show that one person's courage to stand up for fairness can create ripples of change. This applies not just to law enforcement, but to everyday life. Whether in family dynamics, workplaces, or communities, it is easy to look the other way when we see something wrong. But real change happens when we hold ourselves and others to a higher standard, not out of anger, but out of a commitment to doing what is right. For older adults who may feel their influence has diminished with age, remember this: wisdom, experience, and moral clarity are powerful tools. Speaking up, mentoring the younger generation, and sharing life lessons can be just as impactful as direct action. A lifetime of knowledge carries weight, and using it to inspire fairness and integrity is a legacy worth leaving behind. As Eric's story shows, the badge, whether literal or symbolic, does not make someone above others. It makes them accountable to everyone, and that is a principle we should all strive to uphold in our own lives.